Hey everybody, I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy and Plato's dialogues, specifically Plato's Parmenides, what many consider to be the greatest philosophical dialogue of Plato, especially some of the French. So, existentialists, postmodernists, etc. So, I have been going through here. We've been steadily working through many Greek philosophers, and if you watch my other talks on Greek philosophy, you will have heard me say a couple of times that Plato, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, along with his student Aristotle, of Greek philosophers, he is very famous because he collects a lot of philosophers together and gets to go back and forth with and against them. And what Plato seems to do in his dialogues is early Plato takes Socrates, who is very skeptical and talks a lot like Heraclitus, and says, what does any expert really know fully? Because we're all mortal. And then around Book 2 of the Republic, he gets sick of that, and he has Socrates start lecturing in a much more Pythagorean, Trinitarian way. And then the next day in the Timaeus, the Pythagorean comes in and gets very Pythagorean about the cosmos, such that we have the self, the city, society, and the cosmos as a three, and then you have the stomach and the heart and the head, which is three, and you have threes and threes and threes, and Neoplatonists and Timaeus and others, and the Neoplatonists are somewhat thus Neo-Pythagoreans, are going on and on in very Pythagorean ways. However, I have been saying consistently the whole time that Plato kind of has his cake and eat it too, because he kind of wants Parmenides, who is not exactly Buddhist, but sounds a bit Buddhistic. Heraclitus also sounds very Buddhistic, and the two are quite opposed, and Parmenides does not like Heraclitus, neither does Plato, in Plato's words, via Socrates and others. But that Plato has Parmenides in this dialogue, it seems. Some say it's incomplete, but it seems like boy Socrates, we have a flashback here, and boy Socrates, who we know is going to grow up and die, taking hemlock after ticking everybody off, questioning everybody dialectically back and forth. Hence Plato's dialogues and the dialectics. That Parmenides says, if you train in dialectics, kid, as the older master, and boy Socrates seems impressed, and it seems to end as if Parmenides is very right, but Parmenides sounds very skeptical, and he doesn't sound very much like Pythagoras is right that numbers are just correct in the cosmos entirely. That if you go back and forth, though, Parmenides says, and you say X and not X, Y and not Y, Z and not Z, and you debate everything back and forth and take every position, and if you debate them back and forth like my student Zeno here, who's with me, hey, take it away, Zeno, and demonstrate with Aristoteles, who's not two of Aristotle in a trench coat. It's actually a guy named Aristoteles, as if it's the plural, confusingly. He says, you will be unbeatable. And we all know, if we are part of Plato's audience, or you've been listening to these talks, that Socrates grows up, is unbeatable, and then they force feed him hemlock. So Plato's audience knows, as Plato is saying, our father Parmenides, who art in the non-dualistic dualisms of sorts, such that motion is technically impossible for Parmenides, that all is one. Buddha says, once you're past the transformations, very much like the flame of the cave with Heraclitus, once you're out of the cave, you smile on everything equally as the sunlight, and you just shine on everything equally. Parmenides, weirdly, is like there is no dualism, all doesn't move. And so oddly, either Heraclitus or Parmenides is kind of like the Buddha, alternatively, but Plato wants to have math be objective truth, but then he also wants all to be one. Now, watch the talks on Parmenides as well. Pythagoras comes first, then Parmenides. Watch those talks, and before this, if you would like, although you could just get into this one. But you will notice that in both the Pythagoras and the Parmenides, there is a problem where there definitely seems like many things, but all is also mystically one. That Pythagoras says this because all is mystically one, and yet there's math in the universe as the objective higher true truth and mental truth over the physical, within, above, what have you. But then Parmenides also just much more blatantly from another angle says, oh, by the way, motion and division is impossible, all is one. And that seems to kick math entirely and all human perceptions and practices to the curb, doesn't it? If all is undividably one and motion is impossible, why would we need math or multiples of anything then? Sets, nice theory. So in this, you have a text in which Plato is really at his most skeptical, which is why I like this text and why French philosophers like this text, and the French follow Hegel and the Germans a lot. Hegel thought himself that this is Plato at his finest in dialectic. Whether or not that's true, I will go ahead and get into it and we shall see. But this is one of the best. I have already said the Symposium is really Plato's best drama. The Republic is really Plato's most quoted and centrally celebrated work, at least especially in America, but in plenty of places, especially as we get into republics and we like those things in more modern history, like Iran, etc., that you would then have the Republic of China, and Korea and all that, everywhere republics, it's amazing, that you would then have Plato, beyond all that, you have his Timaeus, which is really Plato's cosmology, and I mentioned that is actually Plato's most important text when it's physics to people for a long time. But now you have the Parmenides, which after his Pythagorean physics, it is really good to come way up out into the sunlight out of the cave and be blinded by the sunlight and maybe see math forms. But this is very much staring the final sun in the face as far as Plato. Now we're going to do another dialogue. I don't do all the dialogues for this class or this series, but we are going to do the Theaetetus, which gets a little weird. But in that we have Socrates saying, well, and now we're at the final stage where there sort of is and isn't form, isn't there? Which we're doing here, and I am putting these in as appropriate an order historically and philosophically as I can. That after we have the Pythagorean metaphysics and the cosmos is threes within threes within threes, which was the structure of a lot of physics for Christians and Muslims for hundreds and thousands of years, that you then, along with that, then have this sort of mysticism, which may be quite illusion, in which Plato is saying, but all is one and one is all, which almost sounds like Heraclitus, except Plato hates him. And so does Parmenides, says he does not like Heraclitus. So how is Plato going to fit all this together in a totem pole? Well, it gets a little weird, and then at the end of the Theaetetus, the last talk we'll do on Plato, Plato has Socrates say, by the way, I got to go see a man about a trial or a horse or the upper half of the form of one, I don't know. And we know, well, what's that going to be? Well, we have here, boy Socrates is going to learn how to tick everybody off completely, a la Parmenides. And he says, rock it out. Your whole life for years, kind of like Confucius, study, 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 and then you become, quite one with everything. Again, a Buddhist monk goes into the pizza place, says, make me one with everything. Yes, well, Parmenides thinks you're mystically one with everything, whether you like it or not, quite physically. So you have here something like staring into the sun outside the cave and wondering whether or not math is totally real or human frames and concepts, which is just as modern wrestling with postmodernism and modern science as it is wrestling with the Greeks. And I then say it's not just the Greeks. For the Protestant white folks, it's, of course, who don't like being Roman so much, or Catholic, not part of that empire, and got into being Greek in the last couple hundred years as they separated off from the Catholics and the post-Romans, is that you have here, of course, the Indians, the Chinese, and others ask very interesting, similar questions, and you can look at my talks on, and please listen to my talks on Indian and Chinese philosophy, in which I try to mention the crossovers, but of course can't mention everything in words. Certainly Parmenides doesn't think you can. Why would you have to? So in Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, a young Socrates encounters Parmenides and Zeno and debates with them about whether or not there is an ideal form or a distinct form of the good at all. And he ultimately says you can go back and forth on it, which is why Plato is often perceived as saying there is an eternal form of the good, and that's book 1 to book 2 of the Republic, as we just covered. So now here he says, so there sort of is and isn't a form of reality. And it's like, now, wait a minute. You're saying you're not Heraclitus and you're not that jerk. Now you're saying there are and aren't permanent forms in Pythagoras and math. And honestly, I'm going to much leave us right there with Plato because I do think that is the better educated view of Plato. He kind of doesn't really know at the end, a bit like Russell, but I'll get to that next semester. In the Parmenides, while Plato has Socrates argue there is indeed a form of the good, in other late dialogues, in the Parmenides, Socrates is not able to counter Parmenides, who argues that the one, the only real and true thing, has no differentiation in it at all difference being illusion, which would actually suggest math and forms are ultimately human perceptions and a lower vision of the one that we have from beneath it or something like that as it. Again, strangeness with Parmenides. Some scholars believe that the dialogue is incomplete, and that Socrates would have proceeded to prove to Parmenides that there was indeed a form of the good. Now, this is why, and I'm not going to make that claim. I don't think people completely can. But you can see why, because if this isn't it is weirdly Plato, and he doesn't resolve, but if people want Plato to resolve into a total position, which he need not as a human thinker entirely, that he would have to come to some side here, and he may not. So in the Timaeus, Plato argues through his character Timaeus, the Pythagorean, that rationality arrives at the singularly real, which is eternal and unchanging. The one, identified with nous, mind, Allah, and Anaxagoras, it leads us like a cow, our lower bestial self, unfolds into a model in which the demiurge, I already mentioned, is kind of Jesus for later theology, identified with the logos, breath, spirit, logic, parsing things from many into one, from one into many, and parsing out and forming the forms, which requires manyness out of oneness, that the demiurge forms everything and actively creates all the temporary things of the sensory and unreal world, which makes the demiurge like the fire to the sun. The demiurge is like what Heraclitus is contemplating, not realizing it's not the demiurge and the manyness, it's actually the oneness behind it for Plato. He thinks Heraclitus gets it wrong, oddly saying very similar things. So ancient and modern scholars have debated whether or not Plato believes here that the plan is more properly of the one or of the demiurge, or how the one could have multiple thoughts in itself the demiurge can copy if the one admits to no manyness, of course. How does God have thoughts if God's entirely one, and we can't sort of see it or presume. If the one formed the plan in mind and then spawned the demiurge, then there is indeed differentiation in eternal static being, it would seem, at least from our angle, but who are we? And Plato is more Pythagorean than Parmenidean. If, however, the demiurge and its logo speech, that's the differentiation of everything in time, made but perhaps not begotten or forgotten, then there is no difference in eternal static being. The demiurge is itself just some sort of mask or face of what is actually in reality the all-oneness that never actually differentiates, and Plato is more Parmenidean than Pythagorean. Perhaps Plato saw it much as Parmenides, that Pythagoras is right, but only about the formation of the real and unreal as a pair in our dualistic thinking, and so all particularity, including that of the forms and of the demiurge, are unreal and illusion. If we view things from below, then Heraclitus is right about the lowest, the temporary and chaotic, down with the stomach and desire and perspectives of many subjectivities. And Pythagoras is right about the highest, the eternal and the formative and objective mathematics singularly altogether, whether or not Gödel is incomplete. However, if we view things from the very top, then only Parmenides is right about the eternal beyond the motions of the formative. Just as previous Greek philosophers subsumed the positions of those before them, as Hegel does like heck, including all of this, showing how their positions were somewhat right but somewhat wrong, Plato may very well be stacking Parmenides atop Pythagoras somewhat mystically and leaving that part unsaid, which how could he not? How would he calculate to the oneness? And Pythagoras atop Heraclitus. Heraclitus rightly understands the shadows of the cave, rightly, but lowly. Pythagoras rightly understands the fire at the mouth of the cave, or perhaps that's Heraclitus. Again, it gets a little bit weird and murky, but it is a decent stack upward. But only Parmenides rightly understands the sun. I would say here more as I'm thinking about it now. Common people, Heraclitus about the fire, Pythagoras and Parmenides are outside as the trinity of people in that woodcut image I used for the cover of the last video. And then oddly, perhaps Parmenides is the topmost of the three, or something odd like that for Germans in the woodcut. Or at least one German, So, however, again, this creates the problem. How do we have forms and yet all is one? And then there's shadow puppets projected out from the one and yet all is one. Where's the projection go within itself at all? How does stuff move around and yet it's all an illusion that things move around? Well, that's weird, because how does it move within not moving in order to not move? But on Heraclitus' side, all is moving. There is no stability at all, and is there no stability at all, and is there only total change? What do we see either way? What do you see to see change or stability? So what if the demiurge, like Pythagoras, is unable to see itself the unity of the model and the things, of the eternal and the temporary, because it's a lower being? Perhaps we can view reality as an illusion like Heraclitus, as distinctly real and illusion like Pythagoras, and because if math is real, that means that other things are less real than math, yes, if math is truthy true. And that means the fires and the ferns in front of our face aren't as real as math. And Nietzsche mocks this in Plato. It's like, why are invisible things more real than real things for folks? Anyway, after all this time, with the polytheism, the monotheism, the secularism, I mean, come on, folks. When do the invisible things fully come to dinner here? As again, Confucius says, you're worried about feeding ghosts and you can't feed real people. You know what I mean? Like, why are you worried about the afterlife? Live this life. And then, yeah, there's plenty of stuff, hopefully later. So all of these thinkers, Plato, Pythagoras, Parmenides, and actually Heraclitus, all of them, they all believe the one to be eternal, and all believe the sensory world to be somewhat the illusion, and that reason leads us beyond. Is Parmenides the most foolish, who denies the truth and reality of everything we see, or is Parmenides the most wise, who encompasses the truth and illusion of illusion itself into the singular and eternally true? Perhaps Zeno understood Parmenides best, and knew that Parmenides never hoped to free us from illusion with words and distinctions, but wanted to show us the underlying unity of illusion and truth by dad-joking us somewhat like the Oracle, Delphi, but also like Zen masters and Taoist tricksters, etc., showing us the impossibility of distinguishing anything without contradiction and illusion, which does seem a decent case for Parmenides, that he's being a trickster of sorts as he speaks. And he knows he is, and that he knows he must contradict himself at some point like humanity with his vision, and dualistic eyes rather than one eye in the middle of the forehead. So Plato's Parmenides begins with Socrates challenging Zeno. Zeno argues that sameness cannot be different, and difference cannot be similar. Socrates says, this is the problem of one and manyness. I do like using this example of my hand. So if I tell you that this hand is one, not many, because in a certain sense, one is opposite many. Yes, there's an opposition between one and many. So this hand is one thing, not many all separate, right? But at the same time, you can look at this hand and say, but it's many different things. So it's certainly many. It's a lot of cells, it's a lot of blood vessels, it's a lot of fingers, it's a lot of stuff, right? But if oneness isn't manyness and manyness isn't oneness, which is this hand? Well, Wittgenstein would kind of suggest, well, you look at it as a oneness, the duck rabbit, you look at it as a manyness, you can kind of go different ways on it and interact with it. I think that's the best answer. It's a vague answer, but it's a very good answer, though it doesn't tell you everything. In a certain sense, that is the problem of the one and the many. That's not what it was called in ancient times, but people who actually do Neoplatonism, and I got to learn some of that, they talk about the problem of the one and the many in more modern speak. And so in doing that, you basically have that Zeno and Parmenides may be arguing something like, well, that's sort of the illusion of me talking, hey, it's one, but, and that's in a certain sense the easiest way of introducing someone to what it seems that they are doing, no matter what it is they believe that means, which is the tricky part. But you can lead people kind of through it and show people why they are doing it. It just may not come to happy conclusions for you and I. And I do like to lead people through those motions because then you can see why other people are interacting with them in other schools better. Much certainly. Not that those schools are entirely certain. So Zeno is saying what is same cannot be different. What is different cannot be same. In other words, what Zeno is kind of saying, to make this clear here, because that is a weird line, this hand sort of can't be the way it is. And that's kind of what Parmenides says, because technically, and Zeno knows he's doing this to young Socrates, who's younger and less accomplished and less sure of himself at all in dialectic. So Zeno, the younger guy, comes up to Socrates and says, okay, so is this one, is this many? I'm going to say one, it can't be both, but it's both. So what gives, buddy? That's what he's doing to Socrates in context. He's saying, is this one or many? And I do that to students all the time. Is this one or many? What do you think? And he's doing that regardless of what he thinks. He's trying to screw with Socrates. And Socrates is screwed with, and I don't get it. And Parmenides says, well, try it for years, kid, and then you'll be like us, is what he tells Socrates. And it seems, given Plato's dialogues, unless there's a plot twist or two cut off here, we know what's going to happen, because Plato wrote that play and had put that on already. Socrates is going to get death by hemlock for questioning everyone and being better than absolutely anybody because he knows he's equally stupid as everybody. So he can beat the heck up out of everybody. And is the same kind of Zen kind of a block-like Taoistic ignorance of Socrates, etc., or a totally different shade? So Socrates says we can get over this one manyness contradiction. Sameness difference, notice, is very much oneness, same, manyness difference. We can get over this contradiction. So you could say the problem of the one and the many is very much the problem of sameness and difference. And think about subjectivity and objectivity. Objectivity is a oneness. Subjectivity is a manyness in a lot of ways across human cultures. It would have to be if you think it out and feel out the different ways of it. Socrates says we can get over this contradiction by distinguishing the eternal forms from temporary things. So Socrates says something very Pythagorean as a boy, and now here again, we had early Socrates, but he didn't talk this way. But after the Republic, it seems, which is why we're placing this along with other scholars did before I did, of course, and I credit them. That's why we're putting this dialogue here, because Socrates sounds Parmenidean as a young boy, which he really shouldn't if you've been following the talks. Socrates says we can get over this. We just put the eternal math forms. Now, this is why this is such a tricky dialogue, because Plato's kind of already stated like he's a Pythagorean, and he's down there, and this is Socrates taking that point. And now he's going to go up the chain, and now he's going to get kicked in the teeth by Parmenides and Zeno, who are going to be like, okay, so you're Pythagorean. Well, guess what, kid? So let's watch, again, this unfold here. The oneness unfolding into possibly the Tractates or not at all. So Socrates says we can get the eternal mathematical or form of a horse or something, the temporary things participating in the forms relatively, distinguishing those from that. Just as things are themselves one and many, being singular things with many parts, like the hand, so too are the forms one and many, particular forms that themselves are unified in the one itself. Now that would make sense from a Pythagorean angle. You have many forms, there's the form of the horse that forms with other forms into the form of oneness branching out of it. Kind of mystically, but it's oneness branching into manyness like the Tetractes. So there's a form of a horse, it participates in other branchings of branchings, and then that goes up into the trunk of oneness. Socrates says that he would be impressed if someone were to show that the forms themselves are contradictory and have contradictory qualities. So he asks for it. Specifically. So Parmenides then proceeds to dominate the rest of the dialogue. He actually then steps aside and lets Zeno and Aristoteles, he basically lets them take over a bit, but he is basically the master. And then he's like, let me even let these guys talk it out for you. I'm pretty spent. I'm spent. Tosses camera with Austin Powers. So actually, Parmenides does come off as the Grand Master here, and he doesn't even have to. This is also a Buddhist trick as well, is like, rather than have the main guy talk, you're like, hey, I'm just going to let my student tell you, because he can even tell you better. And that actually demonstrates that the students can pick up absolute truth, or at least a very certain truth from the master, because if the students can go off on their own, and the master can sit back quiet, that definitely impresses us and makes us think, wow, there really is something being conveyed here, and they can clearly do it independently than Parmenides. That's something you find in Buddhist thought, and that's partly what the Zen are testing you for. They're trying to see if you can do it off on your own. And there's specific allusions to that in Buddhism in a lot of complex ways. So Parmenides like, okay, watch this. By the way, my guy Zeno can show you that being itself has contrary qualities. This hand as a being has contradictory duck-rabbit qualities. And not only can I kick you in the teeth with that kid, I'm going to step aside and let my second in command do it for a while he kicks around a guy named Aristoteles, who he's dumber than Zeno, and he can kick him around all day long. I'm not even going to talk to you anymore. So he's actually like, okay, watch this. You and I are going to shut up, and we're going to let those two duke it out like idiots. And watch Zeno, my second in command, work this over. Work that guy over. That's what actually happens in the course of the dialogue. And then we're having this all demonstrated. Hegel's like, that's dialectic, back and forth with some of the core issues of philosophy. And then Hegel inspires the Germans who inspire the French. And that leads even to postmodernism today. As an actual connected lineage, again. Not only do you have Neoplatonism up through the Middle Ages, and the French know something about that, but then postmodernism, the latest, hippest of stuff. My video about postmodernism keeps getting more hits almost than anything. People like that concept. This again fits into, I won't tag with, but fits into postmodernism even. Because the French like this text. So Parmenides dominates and then steps aside. And now, just like Timaeus, the Pythagoreans, Socrates becomes a yes-man interlocutor who then fully steps aside for Aristoteles. Parmenides asks Socrates what forms he is endorsing. Give me an example. And Socrates replies that, like a Pythagorean, he believes there are mathematical forms and ethical forms of virtue, but he is not sure. Notice the Republic is an ethical form, a social form. If we stay in that, we're nice and ethical and good. The best possible city, best possible individual, put the heart over the stomach and put the head over that. But he is not sure whether or not all things, particularly mud and hair, have ideal forms. Now, this is actually where Plato is not an immaterialist versus a materialist. Plato, like Aristotle, very much believes there's higher forms of light and fire. I have argued this with people. People have traditionally thought, oh, so Plato's an immaterialist. It's more like Ghostbusters, which is itself sort of 80s rehashing of spiritualism of the 1800s. It's sort of like spirits are made of ectoplasm, but more light and fire, and then there's coarser material down here that's mud and hair. We are more people now who have had religion, which was the cosmology, and science and scientia, step aside for modern forms of science, and there are now people saying, oh, I'm a logical science person, I'm not religious, and identifying that way. I always caution people to remember you're human and have a human mind, and if religion looks kind of crazy, well, remember that's how we all look. I try to point that out all the time, going through texts like this. So given that, it should be mentioned, Plato's not actually a complete immaterialist. He actually, through Socrates, as a Pythagorean who believes math is the truthy part, the more mental part, the more truthy, fiery, light part, pyramid part of the physical, mental cosmos, he does put the mental over the physical, but he thinks that mud and hair may be chaotic, messy elements that don't participate in form as much as fire and light. Now that, again, does not make him so dividedly from Aristotle. Again, invisible basketballs with Raphael, not the Ninja Turtle. Again, pointing up versus palming the basketball with Aristotle. As people say, yeah, there's the different emphases, but actually, well, again, Euripides, you're buying them. So, Parmen, nothing can be split with an axe a la Anaxagoras. So you ain't anaxing anything, pal. So, especially with Parmenides. So, pardon my Parmenides. So Parmenides says, so what are you talking about? And Parmenides and Socrates says, well, I think there's forms, but I'm not really sure about mud and hair. Well, Socrates here, not only did Socrates ask for it, he has now opened up some floodgates, hasn't he? I mean, somebody could attack him here. Well, there's forms, ideal math forms, but I'm not really sure if hair is very mathematical. It's like, well, that's a big window, to climb right in, So Parmenides tells the young Socrates, given this is already dumb, that after he is older and wiser, he will have come to see the truth of these things that he asserts. Parmenides, how much of it is true? Both and both. So Parmenides then brings several arguments against the position that there are distinct forms of things that are simply real and eternal, arguments much like those we examined previously with the Eleatics. Look at the Parmenides and Zeno videos. So oddly enough here, this is why some people think this dialogue is incomplete, because Plato doesn't fully talk this way, but he ends up almost like Parmenides has the final word and is the master arguer, or then steps aside and let other people do the busy work and the lesser work for him. So is Plato presenting Parmenides or Pythagoras as superior? He definitely says a lot this way and that way, but again, for all the issues we've already talked about with me holding up my hand a couple of times, was it one or was it many times? Do you remember? Maybe it was both. That in spite of all of that, well, the table's holding up my hand right now, is that in spite of all of that, you still have problems here. Is Plato saying all is one, or is he saying actually math is completely formally real? Well, here he seems to say yes and no both, which sort of shouldn't be, because that sounds too much like Heraclitus. So first, Parmenides asks Socrates, this is, again, right here, is some of the best, according to some, and incomplete according to others, some of the best, according to Hegel and Germans and then French folks of the 1800s and 1900s, which is some of the hip, interesting philosophy of history, not for the American analytics, but unfortunate, that Parmenides asked Socrates how many things can participate in a form at once. How many can you cram in there? Let's say you have the form of a horse. How many horses can you fit into the form of a horse? Is it infinite? Is it one? Is it many? What are we talking about, kid? Let's say you have a form of math. Okay, how many 2 plus 3 equals 5s are there? How many? 1, 2, 17, 3 million? Potentially an infinite? What are we talking about? It's a very interesting question to ask. How many 2 plus 3 equals 5s are there quantitatively, ain't it? If a form is present in many distinct things, and here he's not even talking quantities, he is first and foremost talking about the form of a horse, as we have, which is why I keep saying the top half of the horse, or the back half, as it were. Then the form, if the form is present in many things, so if the form of a horse is in all horses, right? It's in the DNA or it's in the math of the horse, right? then the form must be many. Because if it's in one horse and then there's a couple leagues away there's another horse, or if there's horses in the Americas, right, unknown to these guys, then the form of a horse would have to be in multiple places at once, right? So the form of the horse would have to be not one but many, right? Like if I tell you that if no two horses are genetically identical, then the genetic form of a horse has to be many genetic forms of horses, right? It can't just be one in pure isolation because it's in the Americas and also in Arabia. So obviously the form of a horse has to be multiple forms of a horse, right? Here, one can say overlapping vaguely, yes? And not one. But that's, of course, if there's one form of a horse, that kicks that right, that looks that right in the gift teeth, don't it? Let us use the example, again, of this. If there is the, again, predate myself. Parmenides uses the metaphor of a sail. This is a very useful metaphor, covering many people, arguing that the sail does not touch each person at the same point, but each person in a different place. If no two horses exist in the same location, how can the form of a horse not participate in each horse differently? Now that is a very good argument to make. If somebody says categorically there is a genetic form of a horse, which is why horses cannot mate with cows, and I think we can thankfully agree with that, at the same time, you say, okay, what is the pure categorical form of a horse? And these arguments do decently push, they don't answer anything perfectly, but in modern think and psychology and mind, like the ancient, with how much difference or sameness, yes? It seems like this is actually persuaded, but there couldn't be one form of the horse rather than vague kind of genetics. In a certain sense, you are, with all the mutations, not identical even to your identical twin, yes? So how can there be one form of human genetics or something like that as one form of humanity? It would have to just be vaguely kind of, Wittgenstein says, with ragged edges, overlapping, one could say. Yeah, it's kind of vaguely the form of humanity, but it couldn't be one categorical form if it's in Africa and here and everywhere, right? Well, that's what he's saying. It's quite the perplexing argument, and it is just as perplexing as me holding up this hand, which is why I do this concretely all the time, and I remind people, the Hopi and everybody else could hold up a hand and argue these things with everybody, whether or not they wrote it down, because people have a lot of time on their hands. I don't, you can see. There's none of it, right? Yeah. Can you see anything moving with Parmenides? No. So there's no time here at all, right? Yeah. So Socrates replies that it does not seem that many things equally participate in a form. Horses do all seem to share the same identical form, right? They're all horses, categorically, right? We look at them, they're horses, yes. Avicenna and Averroes debated this as the greatest debate of Islam. Is the form of a horse a mental category, or is it the physical set of the horses? And Avicenna, my favorite Islamic philosopher also, says no, it's the horses itself is in your mind. It's not actually the physical set of horses, because they could all disappear and I still would have the concept of horses, which is horses. So no, which is not a perfect answer. And Averroes says from the other side, I'm going to be a more classic Aristotelian. These are the guys who brought Europe Aristotle very, very much, along with Al-Farabi they credit before them. And he says, no, it's not the concept of a horse. Horses are the physical group of physical horses. It's not your concept of a horse, and we have impetus to think that also. These two guys are Islamic Neoplatonists, which means they're thinking of this dialogue as Muslims before they give this thought hand over to Aquinas, who then brings a lot of this thinking more so even into Europe. So yeah. This stuff is not only something you can screw with your modern mind. This is stuff that is European cultural history, and we do not often understand it enough in context, as well as completely Islamic history and all of that. Their central philosophers debated these questions, thinking of this text. And then Hegel, who gives Muslims no credit at all in history, sadly as a German, thinks this is the most brilliant thing ever, for logic, for ethics, for philosophy, for everything. I will simply tell you these are deep parts of your mind. And again, Huineng says it's not the flag that's moving, it's not the wind that's moving, it may be your mind moving. So, if we have from Parmenides and Zeno, if you remember, that if a place has a place, then a place has a place has a place, and there's an infinite regress and place has no place. So if a sail touches every person at one point, then the form of the horse is either many or it's one and it's differently touching each horse, which means actually that the form of the horse is different for each horse, which is not what Socrates wants to say either. And in fact, we don't want to say that either. But Parmenides is leading us to contradict ourselves and pushing at the contours of our minds, one could say, like Zen koans do, I argue. We'll again do the, I love Linji and Joshu. That will come soon for the Buddhist and Zen philosophy. So, and it again wonderfully lines up in strange ways and overlaps and diverges with this. So if the form of a horse has the form of a horse, of course, infinite regress, then it's having the form of a horse itself participates in the form of a horse. Is the form of a horse shaped like the form of a horse itself? Well, if it is, then it participates in the form of a horse. So if your form of a horse is shaped like a form of a horse, like stars above, like the form of a horse is the stellar light coming down, which is more for Plato than forms of TCG and what have you, genetics, of course. People spoke of genetics clean up to genes, thinking it was just sort of the descent of the stuff. And then now when we say genes, we mean specific modern understandings and procedures and models. But before that, people just under genetics they spoke of was just the descent of whatever all of it is, and then understood it in all these ways. So here, speaking genetically of horses, even though they're not modern genetics, is totally appropriate because we're talking about the descent of horses one into many, a la birth and manyness and causal energy, etc. Russell, in fact, I'm into Wittgenstein. Russell says in his theory of types, he said Frege's set theory has problems where the set of a set can't be that the set of all things that are not members of itself creates a contradiction. Russell is very aware of Parmenides, and he is not Parmenides at all, but Russell does know about these things and is trying to resolve those more as early analytic philosophy, and then Wittgenstein himself is early analytic, and then one could construe as hardcore pragmatism towards his later career. However, I have not given those lectures in video form just yet, and will soon. So, as critics point out, Russell says, types of sets, that solves the problem, but this kicks the can down the road a la the infinite regress. That this, as other critics and Wittgenstein himself point out, well, but then why don't types have the same problem? You're just distinguishing a type from a set, and then would that not create the same problems? And we won't get right into that entirely right here. But it is interrelated, as you can see. So Parmenides is arguing a form has its own form, and if we say that a form does not have its own form, how can its form have a form so that it gives its form to other things? If math has any form to itself at all, coherently, but not for Gödel in the early 1900s, then how do we know math is extra mathy if we don't math so that math is mathematical, man? How do we horse the horse such that the horse is extra horsey, such that we know the horse is a horse of course? Well, it's kind of circular, and it goes back and forth, supported in many ways in our minds, and we talk back and forth and argue back and forth in these ways here in ancient Greece, India, and China, which is very much logic for logicians here and there and everywhere, like Russell and Wittgenstein. Aristotle believed, to another logician, sometimes called the father of logic, but he was not, because he didn't invent debate, I have to argue. Aristotle believed, like Parmenides, that Plato's forms would have to have forms of forms ad infinitum, resulting in an infinite regress. This is his third man argument. Why does he say third man? Because he's a teleological, intelligent design. Aristotle is, as all these guys are, thinker. So for Plato, like Aristotle and many other Greek philosophers, the heavens are alive with purpose. And just as Timaeus argues the universe is a living organism in which there are many living organisms, Plato's form of a man is itself an ideal man, a living being. If this ideal man itself has the form of a man, then the form of the man as the man sitting next to the man is an infinite regress for Aristotle. Then what's the form of the person? If the form of the person is formed like a person, is itself formed like a person? Well, if it is, you have the problems of Parmenides. So Aristotle seems familiar with all of this, whether or not he makes sense of it or we do. Parmenides follows a similar course as he continues to question Socrates, asking Socrates if thoughts themselves think, which is not only questioning God stuff, but and people are in this time, the gods, and whether their gods are a god, moving from polytheism to monotheism-ish along the lines of Egyptian and Persian culture, Zoroastrians and Akhenaten, etc., which didn't take in Egypt the way it took in Persia with the Zoroastrians. And those are the Magi, somewhat the Magi and others who come visit Jesus. Now, they asked Socrates if thoughts themselves think, if the ideas, now this is because ideias are higher beings. For the Greeks, ideas and theories are visions that are above us in the cosmos that we participate in. So I'm participating in the living ideas. If I have an architectural plan, we participate for Plato and Aristotle in a higher mind or idea that's somewhat like an angel or a godlike being, like announcements of Gabriel, that like as the voice of God, etc. in texts and religions, as if this is the idea and or breath of something, as we went over with the Timaeus. So can thoughts themselves think? I do. Eric Andre at one point in his show, he's sitting around in a dorm room doing bong rips, and he says, does God pray to a bigger God, between coughs? And it's like, funny enough, I don't know if you've ever heard of any of this, but that actually, whether or not he came up with that idea himself or with help, yeah, that's actually somewhat what. And Socrates and many people don't like that questioning right here for reasons. It's like, well, does God worship a God? And it's like, I don't like this. Stop. Is math itself math? Does math like math itself? If math is all mathy math and truthy true, does math like another math? I don't like this talk. Please stop. Does science study things scientifically itself? Please don't stop. You know what I mean? Like, don't, it's like you are pushing my beliefs a little bit beyond this, and I am not comfortable because I can't parse out all oneness. I can't get a oneness of objectivity together itself from all sides and yet talk about it from the various sides. This is making me very uncomfortable. So Parmenides argues that just as a place must have a place which leads to an infinite regress, a form must have a form which has a form which has an infinite regress to it, an idea must have a higher idea which leads not to a static one, a higher conceiver idea, but to an infinite regress, as we conceive of it. Parmenides openly asks Socrates that if we are conceived by ideas, given birth to by ideas, not physical bodies, which are conceived by God or one, then who conceives of God or the one? We know that Parmenides does assert the existence of an exclusive one, which is a sort of monotheistic-y mind-like being. But is he showing Socrates that if there is any difference between ourselves and the ideas and the one, then this results in contradictions and infinite regress in our imperfect human mortal moving understandings? Which is a decent answer here. Thus, there can be no, and this is Plato's Parmenides, so that is an answer for what at least Plato thought of Parmenides, and this is a good source for Parmenides, a central one, just like the Timaeus is a central source for Pythagoras, because a lot of that is lost and or was never written down in the first place. That's why Plato is very important, not just because he's Plato, but because he is bringing us all of these thinkers, and we have very few texts that were preserved. But people in Christianity and Islam did preserve a lot of Plato, along with earlier thinkings and Aristotle, and they weren't really into others. In fact, a lot of these Greek thinkers started to be rediscovered and thought again, such that I can tell you all this context in the 1800s by more Protestant and especially German scholars, which is what would happen in history when the Germans in particular got a good meme with Martin Luther turning away from the door and the theses, and it says, nailed it, you know what I mean? Well, Martin Luther was sort of into being Catholic, but not so much, sort of. He was originally, then not so much, kind of like the one itself. And so, yeah, the Germans and the Protestants got much more into the Greek context of all of this and studying it a bit in the late 1800s, That's awesome. Again, recent understandings with all this stuff, and yet mystical infinite regresses into understanding itself, as we have. So, this means there can be no distinct ideal form separate from each other, which is why is this Plato fully Plato? Later Neoplatonists, such as Eriugena, I wrote my thesis on him, argued that we conceive of the one and the one conceives of us. Sort of an egalitarian relationship with God, which made Eriugena very heretical, in a reciprocal relationship. But he was translating things for Charles the Bald at the time, so he was saved from the Pope and condemnation by that. Just set up in France with royalty, you'll be fine. Can the Pope touch you? I don't know. Depends what's happening in France. In the year 900, which is when Eriugena was going on. Lots of stuff going on in the year 900, It's kind of like Skyrim. Steal a bucket, get chased by the guards. That's a Friday night for everybody. So he argued that we conceive of the one, and the one conceives of us, Eriugena did, in a reciprocal relationship, which would close the loop. That would actually be a very Christian answer. Why does God get born as Jesus? To make the full thing circle all around. That would be a decently Christian answer. Why would God be born of a person? Because the full circle. not infinite regress. If an infinite regress reaches around like the yin-yang, it becomes a continuous circle, and then it can infinitely regress forever, and it's right in front of your face. If that sounds crazy, Hegel says himself, Nicholas of Cusa, the Neoplatonist, inspires Hegel to say a circle is an infinite regress, right in front of your face. Where does the circle stop? Doesn't. How do you know that since you're like 3 or 4? Because a 4 and a 5-year-old learns to say, oh, that doesn't stop. Psh. How do we know that? Neoplatonists thought this is actually proof your soul is eternal in a sense, because your mind can say, oh, that doesn't ever stop. Piaget would say something we don't fully know here. Piaget is wonderful to contemplate with this stuff also. Moves of mind you find in children, when they can explain that a circle goes on forever, which is around 4 and 5 and 6. They just sort of know it does because they've tried before. Like, I don't know, it just, it just keeps going. What part of us is infinite and eternal thus? The sunlight of the spotless mind? Finally, Parmenides confronts Socrates with what he calls the greatest difficulty. So he's already pushing it. If we only know things by knowing their forms, like math or science, and then we only know the forms by knowing the form of the forms, if we only know math or science by math or science, if the forms of forms leads to an or religion, if the forms, theology, etc., if the philosophy, everything, if the form of the forms leads to an infinite regress, if we just further have ideas of ideas of ideas, then we cannot know the forms. If we can't math fully, which is Gödel, decently, then we can't ever fully math. Then why do we have to math things entirely if we can't math entirely? Analytic philosophy was asked, well, if we rationally prove objective truth, can you rationally prove that? And had problems in the 70s, and some people say that never went away and just kind of disappeared somewhat, If the form of forms leads to an infinite regress, then we cannot know the forms. On the other hand, if the form of forms is the one itself, as Plato suggested already in the Timaeus, and the one itself does not have a form, does not have a conception of itself higher than itself, then we cannot know the forms, as we cannot know the form of the forms, because it doesn't even know them itself. Either way, with an infinite regress or terminus in the one, there is no ability for human knowledge to completely grasp the form of the things. This is what Parmenides says. And so there is no ability for human knowledge to completely grasp the temporary things themselves. Even worse, to the horror of Socrates, this would also mean that the forms cannot completely know us or any of the temporary things, which Parmenides argues, and the one cannot know either of us or itself completely. Socrates says, and this is kind of like somebody saying, can Jesus microwave a burrito so hot even he, capital H, can't eat it? It's like, can God ever, if God is so perfect and so infinite, can God ever understand God? Socrates says, this is monstrous, is the translation. I don't want to think about whether the one universe can know itself fully, because I don't like this infinite regress that you're taking me down. Parmenides says, you are too weak of spirit and argument. You are not able to argue yet and understand, and he's going to get force-fed hemlock years later after he listens to this guy, which suggests he's going to follow this advice. He is too young, Parmenides says, and is not yet trained properly. Later Neoplatonists, I wrote my master's thesis on Eriugena, and then Nicholas of Cusa following Eriugena, as mentioned with the circle, they wrestled with this very dialogue in the Parmenides and argue God the One does and does not know itself, just as Eriugena calls it hyperousia, super being. Think about it as superposition being or something like that, where it is being and non-being. Think of the Tao. Think of Taoism. And we're doing a lot of Taoism and Zen this semester for Buddhist philosophy. Being, if I tell you reality as a static positive whole, that reality for skeptical thinkers, and many skeptical thinkers of India, Greece, and China say, then the being is also every kind of non-being. Hegel follows Eriugena and Nicholas of Cusa and says, then all kinds of being, there's kinds of non-being. I always like to freak the students out with the example of a potentiality or a possibility. A possibility is a thing that isn't yet, right? Which means our heads, a la Piaget and children, can grasp beings that are not yet. Now that kind of thing would be a particular kind of non-being yet, which would be being and non-being formed in a very simple formation in your head. I'm not giving any more words about that. I think there's a lot more to say about that. I would honestly contemplate that kind of thing with Wittgenstein's thought experiments. But what that sort of thing does mean is that later Neoplatonists say, yes, God is super being, which when I say super being, I mean the one thing that is reality is all kinds of substance and all kinds of absence, such that it is substance and absence together. So real being is not positive, as Eriugena says. Real being itself is neither being nor non-being, because it is all forms of being and non-being, and that is why we have trouble contemplating it. Because as Eriugena says, we can face the duck rabbit, he doesn't say duck rabbit, that's Wittgenstein, as being, as one, then we can face the duck rabbit as non-being, as many, and that's because we are mortal human beings and are not God. And that is how we have Greek ideias and theophanies and scientific theories, or forms of math, according to Eriugena in the year 900. And he is reading the Parmenides. He thinks the Parmenides is the greatest of the dialogues. Hegel is like, I love this guy. He's the first true philosopher of Europe, which is what I wrote my thesis about. Why Eriugena? Because Eriugena is doing Hegel a bit earlier than Hegel, not fully Hegel, and he's doing that because he is contemplating this Parmenides text. And he's tracing through, and he's trying to explain to a medieval European audience that largely can't write their own names, even if they're nobles. All of this stuff is one of the only Europeans, Western Europeans at that time, who can speak or read or write any Greek in the ever-loving slightest, at a time when sometimes Greek words by some of his contemporaries were translated as God and other times as tree, which is a real super being indeed, isn't it? Speaking of branching oneness and manyness. So knowing and not knowing are not distinct. This is very Neoplatonism afterwards. Knowing and unknowing, very much like meditation, but also like forgetting something or having a potentiality being knowing it isn't yet and couldn't be but could be. Those are the ways that human beings contemplate themselves, with shadows of light and darkness and shade in the mind, like shadow puppets, because we are not the sunlight itself, but we participate in it, filtered, trickling through a sieve, as Lewis Carroll says. So, we are and are not the sun itself. Being and non-being, mystically together as superbeing. Are and are not that. As the Upanishad says, that is you, that art thou. And you ain't, because you isn't. Parmenides proceeds to show Socrates by debating dialectically with Aristoteles, who again is not two Aristotles in a trench coat or a horse costume, which would be illustrative here. I don't have one here to illustrate it with, thankfully. Parmenides leads Aristoteles through a set of exercises concerning the difference and identity of the one and the many, the central problem of Neoplatonism and the core of the Eleatic paradoxes. Like the older and wiser Socrates leads Meno's slave boy, which imitates the earlier dialogue, and the interlocutors of the Republic through questions, Parmenides leads Aristoteles to many contradictory conclusions about the one. Now, this list right here is extremely awesome. This is a wonderful thing. So here is what Parmenides leads Socrates to, but I have distilled it out of the dialogue for you, and I just let this stand right here, and think to yourself whether or not there is any difference in Eastern or Western thinking, which I honestly say it's the human mind, it's skeptical, it's dogmatic everywhere, plenty a la Hegel, ease. So I don't know if Plato's entirely different, but decently different from Buddhism, plenty or worse, but I like to talk about all those things. So given all of that, and given how people often mistakenly think the West is rational and the East is mystical, think about how German and French thought and Plato and Greek thought is very deeply at the core saying something like this along with Parmenides. This simple list. What Parmenides argues and then has Zeno demonstrate. I don't even have time for this. That's the many different arguments. You can deal with the many. He's the one guy. Oh, those two different guys can deal with it. It's symbolic in the text, definitely. Parmenides talking to Socrates. Oh, now listen to these many people, not me. The one, this whole thing, just mental physical reality itself. All, you say all, your mind snaps it all into oneness, right? You say being, bang. It's all the same thing. It includes all the spaces in every room or every cup everywhere. Pointing to Plato's head with the, you guys are fighting a bit. Yes. They're fighting in the sunlight as manyness, actually. I left the window open a bit to have the sunlight image, you know, a la the, and again, the darkness with the light all crossed here. My darker and lighter cats are a feuding and a fighting in the sunlight. All that's symbolic somehow here. So, but is here or is here somewhere else? Yes, a place of a place. The one, this reality, everything, all together, all, the one. Whatever you want to think about that. The one is both one and many, does and does not exist. That's because it's static with Parmenides, and it moves a lot with Heraclitus, although maybe it doesn't. It is the object of knowledge. We can understand it. And it is not the object of knowledge. We're paying attention to something else. We're not paying attention to the undifferentiated one. How much do I tell you about all? I tell you about zebras, not all. The one, all, comes to be and does not come to be. It is fixedly the way it is, and it also entirely comes to be and is new every day for Heraclitus, along with the sun is new every day. The one passes away, dies, and does not pass away. So the one is birthed and does not birth, dies and does not die, is what that also says. The one is in time and outside of time, begotten, not made. And again, along with the cat crunching of the stuff, yes, is please, and the beeping outside, please contemplate the one in the manyness and the earlier talks on all of that. The one is in the many and not in the many. Classic Christianity and Abrahamic religion does not like so much often pantheism. Being a hippie, there's actually evangelical materials I have nowadays from America. If you are a hippie or some pantheist who think God is just nature man or something like that, you're not putting God properly above nature and outside of, but then God's throughout nature and gets to be anything God wants to or involved in it or not. So technically, the Abrahamic position is not pantheism, and sometimes condemn pantheists and hippies as heretics, because God is technically not just identical with this hand in the world. God is panentheistic, as they call it, which means God gets to be in this hand, but above this hand is superior and all of that. Which means that if I'm a pantheist, I say, oh, God's just the rocks and the trees like Spinoza. That is heretical. Somebody tried to stab Spinoza, and for years later he wore the cloak. I got this big tear in it as a badge of honor, because as a guy defying the Jewish community in Amsterdam many years later, I believe in the 1500s, he's into this and other things, and it's like, and he says more pantheistically, well, everything is God. Just like, knock, knock, that's God. It's like, and the normal thing is and is not, which fits this. If I told you this hand is math and reality itself, well, it is, and then that's sort of beyond it, yes, because this isn't just all of math or mathematical, but that somewhat is in the hand, the math, but it also is somewhat beyond it and eternal and not just this passing hand like 2 + 3 = 5 is enduring, right? Something like that. The one is in the many and not in the many. The one has and does not have contrary properties. What that means is the one does and does not contradict itself. That would mean the one is completely coherent in itself, and then from our perspectives, it contradicts itself. Or from its, we don't have that entirely, do we? We only participate in it. As it. That list right there, that is not something you need to believe in or not. What Socrates is told by Parmenides is if you do those, contemplate that. I am not saying contemplate that rather than history. I would suggest, I'll do a bunch of historical context as well, and hopefully listen to my other videos. That's all you need to hear, the one and the many, alone, yes? Nothing else. What Socrates is told before he's force-fed hemlock years later, and we've already seen that, understand, as I've already mentioned, what Parmenides actually tells Socrates, as some of the pinnacle of Western, quotey, actually ancient Greek and then modern European philosophy, which I distinguish because there's Islam and other forms of these very thoughts, yes, Christianity, Islam, etc. What he's actually telling Socrates is that this is the route to brilliance itself. Poe says, be both a poet and a mathematician. Be both emotionally brilliant and verbally brilliant, and mathematically verbally brilliant. And then you will be unstoppable effectively, and you'll be the most brilliant guy around, and Poe thinks he is. Well, Plato and Socrates, no matter how brilliant they thought they were, this is Plato through Socrates as Parmenides. Oddly, Plato playing a lot of hats and puppets here for us. He's telling people, as Plato, who's a bit famous occasionally, he's saying this is actually the formula to Socrates getting killed because nobody could top him. And that's why they topped him, topped him off a bit with the hemlock, in the cup. So yeah, whether or not you like that, what he's actually suggesting is something like Buddhistic or like Taoist exercises of thought, perspectivism on the elephant. And if you wrestle with that, that does not mean there's no objective truth or math. It means that's the jungle gym, that if you climb all over that, you are going to become more powerful than anyone else. if you do that for years. That's what Plato tells, that's what Plato, Socrates, Parmenides tell us as Plato in this. And many consider this thus. This is Plato at his clearest, and other people say, no, this is Plato not yet telling you this is all wrong, I'm sorry, and that's, or not I'm sorry, but no, and by the way, the next day, it's like, no, all that's wrong. I don't present it that way, though, because it definitely seems like Plato believes this enough. So ancient and modern scholars, again, debate all of this stuff. Medieval Christian Neoplatonists such as Eriugena, Nicholas of Cusa, and Ficino, I hope I am pronouncing that right, of the Renaissance of Florence believe the Parmenides to be the ultimate expression of philosophy, Plato's deepest text which springs from the well of the One itself. If, as some scholars have argued, the dialogue is incomplete and Socrates went on to best Parmenides, this would be a great misunderstanding of Plato's work, but I find it quite amazing, as already said. And again, as you can tell, it's not really that one side of that debate would necessarily be correct. Yeah, it's tempting you certainly with that. Hegel, one of the most influential of modern European philosophers, attempted to synthesize these contradictions in a system that would be the ultimate and complete philosophy, a unification of humanity and science, which he did thinking he was right after Newton. And think about Newton's cradle. He thought he could do politics, science, the whole history of all of it, and do it all on Newton and show that Plato was right, and so was Parmenides. Things are back and forth motions, but ultimately they work themselves into the oneness and the mind and the all. So humanity and science are going to be somewhat unified, still distinct somewhat, and it gets hairy in there, but with somewhat the mind and thoughts of God, mediated by spirit, which works in stages throughout history and culture. This, of course, would be another Trinitarian formation, and Hegel likes triangles of mind, spirit, and desire, in an attempt to complete the work of the Republic and the Timaeus by resolving the contradictions of the Parmenides in the one through the stages of modern history, and then comes Marx, who's more the materialist, yes, and the atheist, not the theist. As people say, Marx stood all this on his head, and he says, well, those are the material motions of history, not the thoughts of God, as they were for Hegel. Although Hegel doesn't say these are the actual thoughts of God, that still would be a bit impious, as is Marx's atheism, I'd imagine. Much of the European continental tradition of philosophy has continued until today to wrestle with Hegel and dialectics and a lot of this, which honestly postmodernism could even be seen as skeptical wrestling with Hegel, Nietzsche, and others, and all of this is an easy way of saying it, but there's a lot more to get into, of course. And why would that be? Well, as Hegel says, because objectivity and subjectivity are the issue of philosophy for all time. Hopefully that doesn't seem like a meaningless thing. And again, I do endorse, if the mind and history are like a jungle gym, by climbing through this stuff, you strengthen yourself, even if you end up circularly back where you were before. So I would contemplate these things, you see them in things and do whatever you want with them, because you will strengthen your mind, and that is exercise, which is what Socrates did. Lacan, the influential French psychoanalyst, argued that the real, capital R, the true whole underlying our superficial reality, or our understandings of it, which is sort of one and the same weirdly, is completely contradictory, and our understandings are incapable of capturing reality with one side or the other along any dimension. Thus, any conception, any understanding, even the whole of scientific theory, is a mere image, a projection like the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. The basic condition of humanity is narcissism, according to also American politics. But, in this economy, that for Lacan, narcissism is the human condition. Our insecurity resulting in attachment to images of ourselves, of things we desire, like when we're 3 and look in a mirror or a stream for Lacan, and of our understandings of things we desire, a basic inability to be open to the whole in the process. What actually Lacan says, which is why a bunch of people think that's hip, people will never sort of understand what America is, or what Christianity is, or what whiteness is, or what anything else is. So people sit there trying to gain oneness to it, and Lacan, as a French guy, is worried that makes us kind of fascist, which I imagine no academic has ever said in the past couple of years at all. You know what I mean? So with the Timaeus, I actually mentioned that Zizek, one of the more respected continental philosophers today, and a devoted follower of both Hegel and Lacan, is definitely a Hegelian and a Lacanian, wanted a third pill, not one that distinguishes reality from illusion, but shows reality as illusion, shows reality as ideology. This is actually, whether or not it is or not, or both, is similar to and different from Plato's Parmenides, who led Zeno, Socrates, and Aristoteles, hopefully not more than one of them, that would be trying, through contradictions to show them that truth and illusion, reality and fantasy, can never be fully distinguished. I will leave with a word of Joshu. Again, I do love working him into stuff, and soon we will have that. A monk asks Joshu, possibly the greatest Zen master of Tang China, which is its formative early period, what is the meaning of Buddhism? What are the true facts of reality? What's the real secret going on here, in other words? And Joshu says, till the end of time, you will never single it out. That said, have a wonderful day out there in the sunlight. Again, be one in many, and how can you help yourself? And I will see you in the sunlight, if I ever see you.